I'd studied there for a while during college, so I knew the language pretty well, and we were financially stable enough to afford it. We had planned on exploring all of Tokyo. Being one of the largest and densely populated cities on the planet, it was almost like a world of its own. A country within a country with diverse districts that might as well have been their own towns. For the first 4 days, we visited almost every part of the city, from the anime and manga shops of Akihabara to the trendy department stores of Shibuya, to some downright bizarre-themed cafes in Harajuku. But after spending so much time in the crowded city, we decided that we needed a little change of scenery. There were a bunch of parks in Tokyo, but they were all crowded by people who had the same idea. We wanted to take a proper hike in a forest to clear our minds after all the excitement in the city, and the closest national forest was Aokigahara, a place most famous for people going there to commit suicide. Needless to say, we decided to go somewhere else. But with the way things turned out, it would have been safer if we had went to the suicide forest instead. On the 5th day of our honeymoon, we took a train ride to Kyoto, a city famous for its adherence to ancient Japanese culture, in contrast to the modern metropolis that was Tokyo. We found a mountainous forest with a hiking trail in the rural area and set out to appreciate the natural beauty of Japan. The rough path took us up the mountains. Flanking us on either side were towering green bamboo trees that made the vibrant purple and pink of the occasional wildflower, or sakura blossom, all the more striking. We walked the path until late in the afternoon, at which point we decided it was time to call it a day. But on the way back, something among the bamboo caught our attention. A fox was watching us from the bamboo forest with blue eyes that almost looked like they were glowing in the shade. This wasn't the typical red fox you could find all over Japan. Its fur was smooth and a shade of shiny silver I'd never seen on any animal before. Naturally, we both took out our phones to take a picture of the anomaly of nature. The moment we did, it darted back into the bamboo forest. We knew it was a bad idea, but the color of the fox was so beautiful that we couldn't help but try to follow it for a picture to show off to our friends back home. The fox was fast, but not so much that we ever lost sight of it. We were able to glimpse the back of its unusually big bushy tail as it scurried in front of us, gracefully darting in between the bamboo trees as we clumsily tried to keep up. We arrived in a clearing in the forest where a traditional Japanese cottage sat next to a waterfall that led down to a flowing river. We didn't even question why it was there or who would be living there. We were just relieved that we found some semblance of civilization after almost becoming a statistic. I knocked on the wooden pillar next to the rice paper door and shouted out a greeting in Japanese. Almost immediately, the door slid open and I was met with the second most beautiful woman I'd ever seen in my life, next only to my own wife. She was a fair-skinned Asian woman with coffee-brown, almond-shaped eyes and a flawless, delicate face that most women could only achieve through Photoshop. She wore a fine silver kimono, fitting for our equally traditional house, and greeted us with a small bow. "Good evening," she said in Japanese. "How may I help you?" Her Japanese was fluent, but I could tell that there was a bit of an accent to it. It wasn't any regional accent I knew. If I had to guess, she kind of sounded like a Korean person trying to speak Japanese. "We got lost in the forest," I replied in my own heavily accented Japanese. "Can you please help us?" She gave me a smile that made my heart flutter against my will. "Certainly. However, it is getting dark and the forest is dangerous at night. Would you care to stay the night here until tomorrow instead? I can lead you out of the forest then." I translated the conversation to my wife and we agreed to stay over. She introduced herself as Hana and even offered to serve us food. I tried to decline, but she insisted, and both my wife and I were hungry from our hike anyways. The food was some sort of meat with rice, accompanied by clay cups of green tea. Though we tried to mind our manners, we ended up scarfing the whole thing down in minutes. It was one of the most delicious meals I'd ever had in my life. She then led us to a small guest room and laid out 2 small futons for us to sleep on. My wife fell asleep almost right away, but I couldn't for some reason. It was odd, since she was usually the light sleeper, and I've literally slept through storms before. I felt an inexplicable urge to get out for some fresh air, so I did. I quietly exited the guest room. To my surprise, Hannah was still awake in the living room. More of the same food she'd served us from before was still on the low dining table, and she was in the middle of eating it. I hastily apologized for the intrusion in stuttering Japanese. She told me that it was all right in the same soft, polite tone she kept since we met. When she told me to sit down so that she could pour me some tea, I saw no reason to decline. I won't go into detail about what we talked about. Long story short, she tried to seduce me as my newlywed wife was sleeping right in the other room. My hormones screamed at me to take her up on her offer, and I felt my body burning with an almost supernatural compulsion to take her then and there. However, it was all drowned out by sheer disgust at the thought of cheating on my wife. I declined her offer to sleep with me in no uncertain terms. She didn't seem angry about it. Instead, a look of surprise spread across her face. "Do you really love her that much?" she asked me. "Of course I do," I replied. "I wouldn't have married her otherwise." There was a tense moment of silence between us. In that time, her surprised expression turned to a look of sorrow. I almost felt bad about making her like that, but nothing was going to make me betray the trust of the woman I loved. "I really do like you," Hannah said before standing up, "which is why I have to ask you to leave." "What?" I asked, surprised. "Right now?" "Yes," she said firmly. "Just follow the river downwards and you'll find a small town there. Don't worry, no harm will come to you, and the moon is bright enough to light your path. Go now, take your wife and get out of here." I didn't dare question her with the way she said it. There was a strong tone of authority in her words that made me not want to defy it. I could have sworn that her eyes glowed blue in the dim light as she spoke, too. I went back to the guest room and woke up my sleeping wife. I told her that Hannah just asked us to leave, and we had to go now. She gave me an earful for getting us kicked out, but stopped when we returned to the living room. Hannah was nowhere in sight, and instead of the cozy cottage we'd arrived in, we were instead greeted with a derelict ruin covered in dust and cobwebs. Lying on the corner of the lifeless living room was the corpse of a man with strips of his flesh torn out of it, the cracked bones beneath them. His cheeks had been completely removed, revealing only toothless gums. When we looked at the low dining table we'd been eating from just hours ago, we realized where all that meat and teeth went. In the bowls that Hannah had served us were white teeth and bone shards, topped by strips of flesh that still had human-like skin on one side. And in those clay teacups was a foul black-red liquid that gave off a pungent metallic odor that could only come from days-old blood. We left the cottage, which had become a desolated ruin in Hannah's absence. With no idea of where to go, I led us down the river as per Hannah's instructions, and true to her word, we arrived in a small town where we met some very surprised people. They told us that the abandoned cottage up the river was cursed, and that no one who'd gone there had ever come out before. They told us how lucky we were to still be alive and contacted the authorities to get us back to our hotel in Tokyo. We cut our honeymoon short after that night. My wife is still recovering from the trauma of what she saw in Hannah's cottage, but I'll be with her all the way. Hannah would probably approve too. Had I not been faithful to my wife, I doubt she would have let me leave her cottage alive.